Under the dim light of a dying flame, a queen lay fighting for her breath. Elizabeth of York, the woman whose blood had ended the Wars of the Roses, was drowning in her own. The sheets beneath her were soaked through, the cries of the midwives fading into the heavy silence of a palace that seemed already to have buried her. She was 37, the crown of England on her head yet slipping into oblivion, abandoned to a fate crueler than any battlefield. Once, she had been the hope of a broken nation, daughter of Edward IV, niece of Richard III, bride of Henry VII, mother of princes and princesses. Her very body had been used as the contract that bound two rival houses into one fragile rose. But on this night, she was nothing more than flesh torn apart by childbirth, a vessel emptied by the very peace she was forced to guarantee. The paradox is unbearable. The woman celebrated as the mother of the Tudor dynasty would not live to see its power unfold. Instead, she bled out in silence, her lips whispering prayers no one could hear, her eyes searching for comfort that never came. Outside her chamber, England rejoiced in the strength of its new dynasty. Inside, the queen who had given it life was dying as if she were disposable. How could the woman who united two crowns be left to vanish in a pool of blood? How could the mother of kings die like a prisoner in her own palace? The answer lies not in love, but in bargains struck, in ambition carved into her womb, and in a silence that has echoed for centuries. Stay with us until the final moment of this story, and subscribe to our channel. Only then will you understand why Elizabeth of York, the forgotten queen, became the first sacrifice of the Tudor curse. She was born into a world of velvet and fire, a child wrapped in the promises of power yet surrounded by shadows she could not see. Elizabeth of York came into life in 1466, daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. For a time, her world shimmered with triumph. She walked through halls where tapestries glowed in candlelight, where her father's victories were toasted in golden cups, and where courtiers bowed before the strength of York. But even in those years of splendor, the air was heavy with suspicion. Her mother's rise from widow to queen had bred enemies among the nobles, and Elizabeth quickly learned that silence was her shield. She listened more than she spoke. She watched faces harden behind smiles. Princes might inherit crowns, but daughters were the currency of peace. She understood this long before she was old enough to wear a crown of her own. In 1483, her world cracked apart. Edward IV, tall and triumphant, collapsed without warning. He was only 40. With his sudden death, the court turned restless, its foundations splintering overnight. Elizabeth was 17. Old enough to feel the tremors of ambition in every corridor. Her brother, the young Edward V, was proclaimed king, but he was only 12. Power never rests in the hands of children. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the man Elizabeth knew as her uncle, stepped forward as protector of the boy king. With smooth words, he convinced the realm that the young king would be safer within the Tower of London, a fortress that was also a prison. Edward was taken there with his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. At first, the sisters were told it was for their safety, that the boys would be crowned in due time. But weeks passed, then months, and the laughter of her brothers no longer echoed through the palace. Elizabeth saw her mother's face pale with fear. Elizabeth Woodville sought sanctuary, clutching her daughters to her side in Westminster Abbey, while rumors grew sharper outside. The boys were rarely seen at the windows of the tower. Then they vanished altogether. London whispered that they had been murdered, smothered in their beds, their small bodies hidden beneath stones. No official word came, only silence that screamed louder than confession. For Elizabeth, it was not a mystery, not some puzzle for historians centuries later. It was a wound that split her youth open. She had lost her brothers not to illness or to the chaos of battle, but to ambition honed into murder. And she knew whose hand had signed their doom. The same uncle who had sworn to protect them now sat upon the throne as Richard III. Imagine the torment. To curtsy before the man many believed had strangled her blood, to wear jewels in ceremonies that celebrated his reign, while inside she carried grief and revulsion. Yet she was powerless. She could not save her brothers. She could not defy her uncle, and she could not speak of what every heart already knew. Elizabeth entered womanhood in that silence, not with dreams of love or stories of knights, but with the taste of betrayal bitter on her tongue. She understood more clearly than ever that she was not free to choose her life. She was a pawn, a symbol, a body that could be exchanged to seal power. From the moment the Tower closed its gates on her brothers, Elizabeth of York was no longer a princess of hope. She was a survivor of loss, a witness to murder, and a prisoner of bloodlines. Power did not fall upon Elizabeth of York like a blessing. It closed around her like a trap. After the disappearance of her brothers, she became the last great prize of the York bloodline. Whoever held her hand could claim not only her beauty but the legitimacy of England itself. Her uncle, Richard III, understood this truth better than anyone. With her brothers gone, whispers spread that he intended to marry Elizabeth, his own niece. To many, it was unthinkable, a stain of incest upon the throne. But Richard's desperation made the rumor believable. In the eyes of England, to unite with Elizabeth was to silence doubts about his crown. For Elizabeth, the thought was a nightmare. To stand as bride beside the man believed to have murdered her brothers was a torment beyond words. Yet she had no power to refuse. She smiled when commanded, curtsied when watched. But inside she carried the dread of a cage lined with jewels. While Richard plotted, another alliance was being woven in secret. Elizabeth Woodville, stripped of her sons and stripped of her influence, saw in her daughter the last chance to keep York alive. Across the sea, Margaret Beaufort was raising her own weapon. Her son Henry, exiled for years, carried only the faintest claim to the throne. Alone, he was a pretender. With Elizabeth, he could be a king. So the two mothers wrote their pact in silence. They did not meet in grand halls or sign declarations with golden pens. Their agreement passed through whispers, through letters carried in hidden hands, through oaths made on trembling lips. The bargain was simple. If Henry returned and seized the crown, he would marry Elizabeth. In that union, Lancaster and York would fuse, and their children would bind the wounds of civil war. When Bosworth ended with Richard's body in the mud, the pact came to life. Henry rode into London crowned in blood, but his claim still hung by a thread. Only Elizabeth could tie the knot tight enough to hold. Yet Henry was careful. He did not rush to the altar. He had himself crowned first, placing the weight of sovereignty on his head without her, so that no one could say he was king only through her right. Only after his crown was secure did he summon Elizabeth, dressed her in cloth of gold, and led her to the marriage that England celebrated as peace. To the people, it was a fairy tale. A golden princess and a victorious king. A rose of red and a rose of white, bound into one bloom. To Elizabeth, It was a performance carved from pain. She was praised for her beauty, for her gentleness, for the grace with which she stood beside her husband. Yet she knew she had been passed from one ambition to another. Her body, the battlefield upon which others had won their wars. Her mother had bartered her for survival. Her mother-in-law had bartered her a triumph. Her uncle had sought to seize her for power. Elizabeth herself had been silent in every bargain. She stood at the heart of a kingdom that rejoiced. But within her she carried the knowledge that this crown was not a gift. It was the price of her captivity. The bells of London rang with joy when Arthur Tudor was born in September 1486. He was the first son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, a child whose very name carried the weight of myth. Arthur, the legendary king who was said to return and heal England, now reborn in flesh. To the people, his birth was a miracle, the living proof that peace had been sealed. To Henry, it was triumph, the anchor that secured his fragile crown. And to Elizabeth, it was both pride and relief, the knowledge that her body had fulfilled the duty for which she had been bargained. The christening was magnificent. Candles lit the great church. Nobles in silks and jewels lined the aisles, and the baby was paraded as the heir of a new age. Elizabeth smiled, radiant in her role as mother of the dynasty. Yet even as the choir sang, shadows stirred. The very joy of Arthur's birth awakened new whispers. For now the line of succession rested not only on Henry's claim, but on Elizabeth's York blood flowing into her son. That blood was power, and power always invited suspicion. As years passed, more children followed, and Elizabeth's chambers echoed with cries of new life. Yet outside those walls, rebellion grew restless. Men appeared claiming to be her lost brothers, or sons of York who had survived the tower. Lambert Simnel rose, then Perkin Warbeck, and each rebellion wrapped itself in her family's name. To Henry's enemies, Elizabeth was not queen, but the key to unlock loyalty among Yorkists. To Henry himself, she was both shield and threat, the woman who had given him heirs yet still carried the legacy of rivals. The air in court thickened with distrust. Courtiers watched Elizabeth carefully when the impostors were mentioned. Did her face pale at the thought one might truly be her brother? Did her silence hide loyalty to the ghosts of York? She never spoke of it. But silence was not protection. It was a canvas on which others painted suspicion. Henry was not a man of warmth. Years in exile had made him hard and cautious. He rewarded loyalty sparingly and trusted no one fully, not even his queen. Their marriage, born of bargains, offered her little comfort when rumors swirled. Elizabeth gave him children, stood beside him at ceremonies, played her role with grace. Yet within, she felt the cold wall of doubt that separated them. She was loved by the people, admired for her dignity, but rarely embraced as a partner by the man who shared her crown. Slowly, the halls that had once welcomed her turned into corridors of watchful silence. Her mother faded from politics. Her allies slipped into shadow, and Elizabeth stood alone beneath the weight of two dynasties. York looked to her as their last hope. Lancaster eyed her as a threat, and Henry saw her as necessary but never safe. The paradox of her life sharpened with every passing year. She was celebrated as the mother of England's future, yet treated as if her very blood might undo it all. She was praised in public but isolated in private, and in that isolation, Elizabeth of York learned that her crown was not made of gold alone. It was forged from suspicion, from whispers she could not silence, and from the knowledge that she would always be both the foundation and the fracture of the Tudor throne. Each birth left Elizabeth of York weaker, her strength drained with every child she gave to the throne. She bore them in chambers heavy with incense and whispers, where pain was constant and death always near. The people celebrated each new heir as a triumph. Yet for Elizabeth, every triumph was paid for with her own blood. Her body endured, but grief carved deeper wounds. Some children thrived, others faded in their first year, and Elizabeth learned to smile in public while mourning in silence. She carried her living children with tenderness, but the ghosts of those she lost haunted her nights. Each time her body was called to labor again, the fear returned sharper, like a blade pressing against her ribs. Then came the blow she could not withstand. Arthur, her firstborn, the prince who embodied the promise of Tudor destiny, fell ill in Ludlow and died at only 15. Bells that once rang for his birth now tolled for his funeral. England wept for its heir. But Elizabeth's heart broke beyond repair. She had endured the loss of infants before. Yet Arthur's death was different. He was the child who had given meaning to all her suffering, the golden hope for whom she had sacrificed her youth and her body. Witnesses wrote of Henry VII retreating into silence. But Elizabeth's collapse was deeper. She locked herself away, unable to be consoled. The weight of her grief showed in her face, in her frail movements, in the hollow of her eyes. For years she had endured childbirth, as though her pain was part of the bargain of queenship. Now she began to understand that nothing she gave would ever be enough. Her health faltered after Arthur's death. The sorrow drained her faster than any labor, leaving her vulnerable and weary. The woman who had once embodied the uniting of two dynasties was now a shadow of herself, broken by the knowledge that the heir she had suffered to bring into the world had been taken before his promise could be fulfilled. Arthur's passing marked the beginning of her own end. From that moment, Elizabeth of York was no longer the queen who had united roses, but a mother whose heart had been shattered, carrying a silence too heavy for even a crown to conceal. Elizabeth of York often looked at her children as if each one were a fragile flame flickering in the wind. Arthur was gone. The Golden Prince carried to his grave at only 15, and his loss had torn a hole in her soul. Margaret remained, destined for Scotland, but far from the English throne. The young Henry, spirited yet untested, now bore the weight of expectation too heavy for a boy. The Tudor crown rested on heirs as thin as glass, and Elizabeth knew the survival of the dynasty still demanded more from her. She was weary, her body pale and diminished, yet duty called again. At 37, she felt the stir of new life inside her. The court whispered with hope, but she felt only dread. This pregnancy was not born of love or choice, but of necessity. A single child might secure the future, or might take her with it into the grave. Elizabeth carried both possibilities in her womb, as if fate itself had placed the final wager upon her body. Winter descended with merciless cold, and the queen's chamber was prepared. Fires burned in braziers. Herbs were hung to ward off sickness. Midwives whispered prayers as if prayers could hold death at bay. Elizabeth entered labor, her face drawn, her hands clutching the sheets until her knuckles whitened. She had endured this trial many times before, but her strength was already frayed. The cries that tore from her throat were muffled quickly, for she had long ago learned that a queen must suffer in silence. Hours dragged like centuries. The flicker of candlelight revealed the sweat upon her brow, the trembling of her lips, the sharp rise and fall of her chest. At last, a child's cry broke the suffocating quiet. It was a girl, Catherine, small and frail but alive. Elizabeth gathered the infant to her breast, her eyes glistening with both love and foreboding. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, knowing this gift might also be her undoing. The days that followed confirmed her fear. Fever rose like fire within her, consuming what little strength remained. Her body shook with chills. Her skin burned with heat, and the sheets beneath her grew heavy with sweat and blood. Midwives tried remedies. Priests whispered blessings, but nothing slowed the relentless advance of death. Elizabeth's world narrowed to the chamber itself, the shadow of her daughter sleeping nearby, the distant sound of bells muffled by stone walls. She reached out once, her hand trembling toward the cradle, but the effort exhausted her. Her voice had grown too weak for words. She lay back, eyes half closed, her breath shallow. On the evening of February 11th, silence claimed the room. The Queen who had been the bridge between Lancaster and York, the woman who had borne the weight of a dynasty upon her body, exhaled her final breath. There was no chorus, no thunderous farewell, only the flicker of candle flames and the hushed grief of servants who dared not break the stillness. Elizabeth of York died not in triumph, but in surrender, her body given over once again to the throne she had served with her life. The Tudor rose remained, but the soil that fed it was watered with her blood. When Elizabeth of York was lowered into her grave in Westminster Abbey, the court bowed in silence. Yet few understood the storm her absence would unleash. She had been the quiet bridge between two warring houses, and with her gone, the Tudor dynasty began to walk a path lined with ruin. Her son Henry, only 11 when she died, grew into Henry VIII, the king who would stain the throne with 6 marriages and rivers of blood. The boy she had once held to her chest became the man who tore England from Rome, who executed queens and friends alike, who turned suspicion into policy. His reign carried echoes of the silence Elizabeth endured, but twisted into violence she could never have imagined. Her daughter Margaret Tudor crossed the border into Scotland and carried the Tudor blood north. From her line would come James VI, the king who would inherit both Scotland and England. Yet Margaret's life was no triumph. She endured betrayal, broken marriages, and the endless suspicion that followed every woman with Tudor blood. Another daughter, Mary Tudor, was wed into France, becoming briefly the Queen of France before returning to England as the Duchess of Suffolk. Her beauty was celebrated, yet her happiness was fleeting, caught between the ambitions of men who saw her as a prize rather than a person. The shadow of Elizabeth stretched even further into the next generation. From Henry VIII came Mary I, remembered by history as Bloody Mary. Her reign was consumed with executions and the desperate attempt to return England to Catholic faith. She burned heresy into the heart of her country, but behind her fury was the same wound her grandmother had carried, the wound of being doubted, of never being enough. Then came Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, who ruled with brilliance and iron resolve yet carried the same loneliness. She died without heir, ending the Tudor line. The dynasty that Elizabeth of York had bled to create ended in silence, just as she had. Her children and grandchildren became some of the most infamous figures in English history, their names etched in fire and blood. Yet at the root of their story lies Elizabeth herself, the queen whose sacrifices were forgotten, the woman whose life was consumed so that others might rule. Without her, there would have been no Henry VIII, no Bloody Mary, no Virgin Queen. The glory and the terror of Tudor England were all born from her body. Her tomb in Westminster stands quiet, without grandeur. But her presence still lingers in every echo of Tudor history. She is the ghost beneath the stones, the mother whose silence birthed both triumph and tragedy. The Tudor rose is remembered for its bloom, yet its roots are soaked in her suffering. So when we speak of Henry VIII and his broken wives, of Mary I and her fires, of Elizabeth I and her lonely crown, we must remember the first Elizabeth, the queen who made them possible. She united roses, but died among thorns. If this story has drawn you into the silence history tried to bury, do not let it fade again. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel. For behind every crown is a woman like Elizabeth of York, whose blood still whispers from the stones of Westminster.